I'm Chanelle Mulopo. I'm a transdisciplinary researcher working at the intersection of climate change and health, mental health, and health systems and policy research. My background training is in psychology, undergraduate and master's in psychology and health promotion, and my PhD in public health. So I'll be taking you today on this topic on stakeholder mapping and engagement in transdisciplinary research. In this public square session, lectures, we've been talking about, co-designing, co-implementation, and, creative methods in transdisciplinary research. And in order to achieve this, we actually need to engage with various stakeholders. So where do the stakeholders come in transdisciplinary research? So that's what we'll be talking about today. So our learning objectives, we have three main objectives. That is to understand the key concepts of transdisciplinary research. So for us to be able to talk about stakeholder mapping and engagement, we first have to, understand where does this fit in within the concept of transdisciplinary research. So I'll introduce briefly on the key concepts of transdisciplinary research. And then our next objective will be to understand the steps required to conduct stakeholder mapping and analysis using a power interest matrix. And lastly, to understand how to develop a stakeholder engagement strategy. So once we identify these stakeholders, how then do we engage with them? So like I said, to start off, I'll speak about transdisciplinary research, what it is. And transdisciplinary research is a collaborative research approach that integrates knowledge from multiple academic disciplines, and then goes on a step further by including non-academic stakeholders to co-produce solutions for complex societal challenges. So while our traditional research usually happens within specific discipline, we have interdisciplinary research that engages different disciplines, and then a step further is transdisciplinary research that goes and brings in non-academic stakeholders. So the key characteristics that we need to remember when we're talking about transdisciplinary research is that it integrates multiple disciplines and knowledge systems, multiple disciplines referring to your academic disciplines and other knowledge systems like the non-academic discipline, non-academic partners. So it engages stakeholders throughout the process. Unlike traditional research where usually researchers will conduct research and then at the end engage the stakeholders, different stakeholders. But with transdisciplinary research, we aim to engage our stakeholders throughout the process of research. So from the beginning, within the process itself until at the end. And transdisciplinary research addresses complex real-world problems that cannot be solved by one discipline, problems that cannot be solved by just academic disciplines, but problems that require academics and non-academics, policymakers, community members coming all together to develop the agenda, to identify what the research problem is, and to co-produce the knowledge and implementation. So transdisciplinary research also produces actionable knowledge for policy and practice. And that's why knowledge translation is a key factor in transdisciplinary research, because the goal is to actually influence policy and practice. So when we look at this diagram, it summarizes everything about transdisciplinary research, but I've simplified it in this table that I have, which talks about when we start in the middle, we find that the key elements that are needed in transdisciplinary research are leadership, facilitation, and integrated knowledge translation. So as a researcher that is embarking on this journey of transdisciplinary research, you need to make sure that you have core leadership qualities. The vision is very clear to create momentum within the project. Your facilitation skills should also be developed because you are bringing in different stakeholders and facilitate the exchange of knowledge among these different stakeholders. And of course, integrated knowledge translation, whereby you want to ensure that your research findings actually influence policy and practice. So ensuring that you engage your stakeholders throughout the process is very important. So the next phase, the middle ring, talks about navigating the network, mobilizing the network. This is when you actually put together your team. How do you ensure that? How do you ensure that you have the right people? You target the right people, and you have the right people in the group. So developing that team, and then negotiating and navigating that team. So you navigate that team, you see, identifying and knowing that different stakeholders within your team have different priorities. So knowing when to meet your different stakeholders. So this team that you have put together has different stakeholders. So it's not just an academic team. It's a team that consists of policymakers. It's a team that is consistent of communities and your academic academic team members. And then, once you mobilize the team, you navigate, you identify each team's priority, because they have different priorities, they have different interests. Begin to understand that, and then negotiate the process. That is, how do you resolve differences within the team? How do you ensure that everybody's on the same page? And lastly, which is the outer ring, talks about what competencies make this possible. So how do you ensure that the leadership qualities, the facilitation qualities, and you have integrated knowledge translation within this and within the whole concept, and navigate, and how you ensure that you navigate, to negotiate, and mobilize the network properly. So in order to achieve this, you must have good communication skills. There needs to be collaboration within the team. There needs to be trust that needs to be built. So within that team, there needs to be relationships that are built, trust that is built. There has to be a knowledge sharing and reflection throughout the process. So this whole concept is what actually enables transdisciplinary research to be successful. Okay, so here we have core attributes of transdisciplinary research. So we have co-production, collaboration, systems thinking. So these are the key concepts that we talk about in transdisciplinary research. And this is just a summary of one of the frameworks of transdisciplinary research as well. So I think from now on, I'm just gonna move on to the next phase of stakeholders. So now that we understand what is involved in transdisciplinary research, the core design, the core production, the core implementation, bringing in different stakeholders together. So when it comes to core design, for instance, you define the problem, priorities, research questions, and method collaboratively. So stakeholders help shape the research agenda. Co-production, you generate, interpret, and refine knowledge through collaboration. So the key word, the key concepts that is embedded in transdisciplinary research is the notion of doing everything together, setting the agenda together, generating that knowledge together, and also actually implementing it. Co-implementation, where you translate evidence into practice, policy, and sustainable action. One thing I enjoy about transdisciplinary research is that just how how every stage is so, like, it has to be carefully planned and thought through, and build relationships and trust between the different stakeholders. So now that we've been talking about this, it leads us to the stakeholder, because all these steps that we are talking about involves stakeholders. It's all about stakeholders. So who is a stakeholder? So a stakeholder can be a person, a group, or organization that has interest or concern about an issue. So in your context, you're talking about your research project, then you have to start thinking about who are the persons or groups, organizations that are interested in the same issue that you are concerned about. Stakeholders are individual stakeholders can affect or be affected by the organization actions, objectives, and policies. So what anybody that is also affected by this research problem or concern that you have. And then stakeholders can be internal, external, primary, secondary, or even tertiary. So the immediate people around you are internal stakeholders. Your external orders are people outside you, and it goes on and on like that. But it's all individuals that are affected by the same issue. And most importantly, we have to note that not all stakeholders are equal. So that's why we have to therefore do the stakeholder mapping and analysis, because we should know that stakeholders are not equal. Therefore, how we engage with them differs. So there are different examples of stakeholders. So we have stakeholders could be your funding agencies, they can be your media, patients, caregivers, the general public, policymakers. So we've mentioned some of these people. And in the the activity that you're going to do later on, everybody, like in your public sphere group or in your research projects, the way you are, or who are coming from the same public squares can sit together and discuss and think about the stakeholders, and those that are maybe with their own, or the others can just form groups. So some of the things that you're just going to think about is, who are the stakeholders. So there are different stakeholders, there are various examples, as you can see here. So why do a stakeholder analysis? So it provides you with a mapping of the nature of the interest, because you want to know what is the nature of the interest, the extent to which the interests converge or overlap. So some stakeholders may have similar interests. Some of them will have very different interests. Others will not even be interested in your work at all, but then they are key to your work. Their importance with regards to the policy, decision, and reform proposed, their influence on the decision, and their relative influence to each other. So stakeholders also influence each other. So you really need to know, how do these stakeholders influence each other? How would they influence any decisions that are going to be made during the research process? So stakeholder mapping helps to identify individuals or groups that are likely to affect or be affected by a proposed action. It helps you plan activities to either improve or mitigate the responses of stakeholders in order to achieve your goals. So in order for you to be more proactive instead of reactive, it's important for you to be able to actually identify and analyze the stakeholders. So these are some of the useful ways or methods for identifying key stakeholders. So these are some of the helpful questions that can inform a list of potential stakeholders. So for instance, in your research, in your groups, you can start to ask yourselves, who will benefit from this research study? And then that's how you start thinking of the different stakeholders. Who holds the most power within your research system? That's how it helps identify stakeholders. Who does not have as much power but will still be affected? So this could be like your community members or people on the ground. They might not have so much power to make decisions or to influence, to make a significant influence, but they'll still be impacted by your research. Who can contribute to the different stages of the study? Who can block your study? So this is also very important, because especially if you're working in spaces like combating non-communicable diseases, or you're working around tobacco and maybe alcohol, so you need to identify stakeholders that may actually want to block your work. So you have to identify all these stakeholders by asking yourself these questions. This can help you to identify the stakeholders. So there are different types of stakeholders. You have active resistors, people that would just be which we refer to as blockers. So they are outrightly want to stop the work or against the work that is being done. This could be because of a lot of reasons, could be political issues. From my experience working in KwaZulu-Natal, we used to have a lot of these political tensions that are happening on the ground that as a researcher, you have no business, you don't even understand. And that's why it's important to really get to know your communities, because there are some tensions in the communities that may be happening that you may not be aware of, whether because maybe, for instance, like in our case, the ANC were in power, but then apparently that area was being governed by DA. So going there as researchers, it came across that we were affiliated with the DA when we're actually not affiliated to any political party, and they didn't want us in certain parts of the communities, because those communities were belong to like the ANC. So any areas where the ANC were like who had majority of supporters, they didn't want us there, because they thought because the DA rules that area, so we sort of belong to the DA. So those are some of the things that can happen on the ground, where you identify, okay, even this type of groups of people, they will actually interfere with the implementation of the project. So identify your blockers. It could be big corporate companies, like I was saying, if you're working in areas like tobacco, alcohol, that might not want to speak to yield information that will go against them, their interest of making profits. So you have active supporters. These are the people that you want to keep close, you want to maintain good relationships with. So these are the people that are your champions. They're supporting your work. And you have passive resistance. So the resistors, they are passive, but they are, we call them avoiders. They're just there, but they're not really wanting to be part of it. And then you have silent boosters. They're passive, but yet they're supportive. So those are obviously those are the people that, you also want to make them to be more active. So, but when you're mapping your stakeholders, you actually map your stakeholders based on where they are currently, not where you would want them to be. So you just identify which ones are your blockers, which ones are your champions, which ones are the avoiders and silent boosters. So we have the power interest matrix. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about this. This is usually what we use when we actually identify our stakeholders and then analyzing them on the level of influence and the level of interest that they may have. So on my bottom left, I have minimal effort. So with this as well, with this matrix, it also tells you how much effort you need to put in depending on where the stakeholder actually is allocated. So within on my left bottom there, you have minimal effort. So because they have low influence and they have low interest, so the efforts there is quite minimum. And then on my right, at the bottom, so low, high. And so there's two ways of going about this. If you want it to be more elaborate, you can have the 9 blocks, but usually you can also have 4 blocks, right? So I'll just talk about the far end 4 blocks. And then on my right, bottom, you have high interest. So this would have your high interest stakeholders, but they with low power. And then at the top again on my left, you have high power and low interest. So these are the stakeholders that you have to monitor and inform occasionally. So they have a lot of influence, they have a lot of power. Their interest is low, but you also don't want to bombard them with so much information. So you just have to make sure that you keep them informed and you monitor them closely. And then on my right, we have on the right end, I don't know how to say that, high. High and high. So where you have high power, high influence, and high interest. So those are like the people that they have a lot of power and they have a lot of interest, and those are the people that you want to manage closely. So we have a few tips on this slide. So when you map your stakeholders, like I said earlier, draw the stakeholders where they are in reality, not where you think they should be or where you'd like them to be. Because this happens a lot. Like it could be a mistake that can happen where you're mapping your stakeholders in your mind, you'd want them to be in a specific place, but that's not exactly where they are. So map them where they are, and then influence, try to see how to engage with them so that you can get them to where you'd want them to be. So include objective colleagues in the exercise. So for instance, when you have your group of people, include colleagues that are objectives, that will not be biased, that will just objectively think, where do you think this stakeholder should be? How would this stakeholder influence the work that we're doing? So each quadrant in the matrix indicates the recommended communication strategy with the stakeholders. Like I've said, you have minimal effort, okay, with these guys, low power, low interest. So they have very less likely to make a lot of change. So even your effort that you're going to put in engaging with them would be minimum. Stakeholder power and influence is sensitive information. Do not distribute outside the core research team. So this also is very important. You don't want any of your stakeholders to come across this information. You don't want them to see that you labeled them as low power, for instance, then that could be offended. They could be offended. So it's very important then when you map your stakeholders, you keep that information within the research group. This information should not leak outside of your research group. So another way of identifying your stakeholders, you have your research team, consult your research teams, consult experts, go out in the community, meetings with the affected communities, help. The community can help you identify important stakeholders, personal networks, snowballing, and also reviewing of published literature. That's how I usually do it myself. When I'm starting out, I start with literature, get into the literature, see who is identifying the literature as key players within that space, contact those people, ask them for referrals, and then you go on. So that's your snowballing. And obviously consult your research team, consult people around you. And once you bring your stakeholders together, once you identify your stakeholders, ask them, I found this to be very helpful, ask them, do you think there's anybody else that you think needs to be in this room and they're not in the room? And then they will tell you, yeah, so and so, so and so, and so and so. And that's how you ensure that you have all the people that needs to be in the room. So once you map your stakeholders, once you have mapped your stakeholders on the power interest matrix, you have to ensure that you review that that power impact matrix regularly. It doesn't mean that because a stakeholder, when you initially map them, they were high power, high interest, they'll remain like that. They might lose interest. So then you have to ensure that and that's why you have to manage them. You have to manage them. For instance, if they have hyper or high interest, keep managing them, keep informing them, keep them up to date so that they don't lose that interest. So it's important to always go back to your stakeholder map and say, is this stakeholder still where we had mapped them to be? Have they moved? If they've moved, then you have to devise different ways of engaging with them. Yeah, so you always have to make plans to modify the way you engage with them. No stakeholders in high power impact. Are there any stakeholders in how impact, for instance, what does that mean? Can you influence them a little bit further? And then you always have to go back and revise. I think I've mentioned this. So once you identify this, then you can now develop this table for all and list all your stakeholders. So you list the name of the stakeholder, what is their role, what is their interest in research, what is their influence, what is important to the stakeholder, how can the stakeholder contribute to the research, how could the stakeholder block the research, classify the stakeholder on the, so this you would have already classified that, and then you just identify how you classified them. And then you develop a strategy for engaging with them, which is what we're going to talk about further. So this is how, this is also how you move then from identifying your stakeholders. Now you develop this table, and then you identify each stakeholder, identify their role, and just fill in all the steps. So, and then the 3 key things that you need to also look into when you're prioritizing the stakeholders, you then have to ask yourself and identify from the list those whom we must interact or communicate. Who do you think it's the must that this group of people are so critical that it's a must for us to interact with them? And then those who should interact or communicate with, and those who we would like to interact and communicate with. So who do we think would like to contribute to communicate with? Who should we interact with, and who must we interact with? Because this group is very, very key to the success of our project. So they do the 2 sides of a coin in terms of advantages and disadvantages. As much as it's exciting, obviously, for me as a transdisciplinary researcher to go through this process, but also it comes with advantages and disadvantages. So the advantage being that you are able to understand all your stakeholders in their environment, you know the role that they play. But then the disadvantage being that it requires a lot of time to actually map your stakeholders, and it's also quite an expensive activity, because it's an activity that also has to be funded, and most fundings do not even recognize this process. So these are the kind of things that we need to actually advocate for, ensuring that this is also embedded in your project cycle as well, your project life cycle. Another advantage is that the focus on the stakeholders with the highest power or influence. So you're able to identify that, okay, this group of stakeholders, they have a lot of power, they have a lot of influence, then you are able to manage them. But also there's a disadvantage to that. The analysis may suffer from bias. So you might also end up putting so much effort in this group and then neglect other stakeholders. Manage any risk to the research and to the research and its use. So you're able, once you have identified the stakeholders beforehand, you are able to manage the risk. But then the downfall is that you can't meet all the stakeholders' needs. And as from my previous slide, I was saying that you identify all the stakeholders. So that's a lot of stakeholders. You have all these stakeholders that you need to meet their needs, and you might not necessarily always meet the stakeholders' needs. So you're able to make better decisions. You are able to maximize opportunities, windows of opportunities when you have your stakeholders. But the issue also with this mapping is that does not really help you to see the relationships among stakeholders, because we don't know the relationship among stakeholders, and that might also have an impact. For example, on the current project that we're working on, the WIMA project that Jill always makes reference to, is that when we bring in like stakeholders, like people that have, especially from the government, that have a lot of influence, for us as researchers, we want to bring them in, but then among themselves they have relationships, and sometimes the stakeholders themselves are not getting along. So you have to be able to understand what relationships among themselves is happening, because if you just prematurely bring all of them in one room and they have some negative relationship among themselves, that will hinder the progress of your research. So you need to know who among the stakeholders can actually be placed in the room at a time, and then navigate those relationships. If this happens, if once you map your stakeholders ahead of time and you're engaging with them ahead of time, there's greater acceptance of research from the participants, even from the policymakers as well, because we're trying to conduct research that has policy influence or practice influence. When your stakeholders, like policymakers, come into your research earlier on in your research, they're more able to accept your research, more able to take up your findings and contribute and use your findings into decision making. And then the disadvantage to that is as much as you bring in all the stakeholders that you think are necessary, you might still miss them, or it will just be too much. So why is stakeholder engagement important? It helps you to identify and determine mutual benefits beforehand, together right from the start. And this is what you want to achieve with your project. So you're able to, once you have that ahead of time, you've identified your stakeholders ahead of time, you are able to identify mutual benefits, and also you're able to keep your stakeholders engaged in your project and get the most out of your project. So communication, knowledge translation is very important to building effective stakeholder partnership. So because I've worked a lot on knowledge translation, which focus specifically for policymakers, I'd like to just focus on that in terms of knowledge translation and the role that it plays when it comes to decision making within the context of our stakeholders. So you find that knowledge translation is getting the right information to the right people in the right format at the right time at the right place in the right way to influence policy and practice. So this is where stakeholders come into when you want to ensure that the right information gets the right people in the right format. So you have your stakeholders there as the right people. And then all these aspects together form what we call a stakeholder engagement strategy. And that is how then you then have to develop an engagement strategy for each stakeholder that you have identified. So building an effective stakeholder engagement strategy involves these steps here. So you have to identify your stakeholders. You have a table that I had shown you earlier on that had a list of all your stakeholders. And then for each stakeholder, you need to develop their own engagement strategy. So you don't have an umbrella engagement strategy. You don't engage with different stakeholders the same way. So you have to develop an engagement strategy for each stakeholder. So the first step would be identify your stakeholder. So it could be a policymaker, it could be a community, it could be whatever organization. And then the next step would then be identify the purpose. Like, why are you engaging with them? Are you engaging with them to inform them something? Are you just trying to make them aware of something? Do you want them to change their behavior? So with each stakeholder, you also have to be very specific in terms of the purpose of your engagement. And then which also informs the message. So if you want the stakeholder to be aware, your message will be crafted in a format of awareness. If you want them to change something, your message will be crafted in a way that that is trying to motivate them to change. And then for the next step would be now the medium. So how are you going to engage with them? So with other stakeholders, for instance, could be maybe if it's policymakers. I'm giving a lot of examples of policymakers because that's the stakeholder that I've worked with mostly. So it could be with policymakers, it could be via email. You can reach them via telephone, via email, via Zoom meeting or whatever. With the community, it could be you have to go there and have a community meeting. So you have to identify what is the medium that you're going to use. And the next thing is the messenger. So you, as the PI or as the lead researcher, sometimes it doesn't mean that you are the best person to convey the message. So you have to look at your team and see who is the most relevant person to actually convey this message. Sometimes it could even be, I remember in one of our projects that I was working on, we wanted a specific stakeholder on a regional level, but they were based in Kenya. And we had a team member within our research group that was Kenyan. And we just thought, hey, that would be, the best place to start the conversation. Maybe you would be the best person to start up that conversation. And it worked very well, and they connected on that. So sometimes you have to look at who is the best person to actually be the person to convey that message. And the timing is important. What is happening during that time when you want to convey the message? For instance, again, when you're working with policymakers, like in my case, where we're working on climate change and health. Climate change and health is now a hot topic. So you also have to understand that you have to understand your stakeholders, the policymakers. Is it something that they're talking about? Would this be a good time to talk to them about it? Probably yes. So the time is important. So like, for instance, there are times when like the topic and what is happening around the world, there's no link at all. So you have to find other ways to actually engage with them. And then the resources, what resources do you need to do that? Is it funding? Is it whatever resources that you need to facilitate that? So in the next, one of the activities that we have would be to develop an engagement strategy for one of your stakeholders. So you have to think about all these steps to develop an engagement strategy for that stakeholder. So this is what the engagement strategy looks like. So you have, so basically it's just what I had in the previous slide, and then you just fill in that what is the goal of the purpose. So you have your stakeholder one, whoever the stakeholder is. You identify what is the goal for engaging with them. What is the main message? What would be the medium, and so on and so forth. The next content that follows this is actually the monitoring and evaluation of your strategy or knowledge translation strategy, which I'm not going to get into. But the first part of the strategy, developing the 𝐤𝐸𝐾𝐻 strategy, is what we're going to focus on in your activity. So, in summary, building effective relationships requires respect, where you respect everybody's opinion. everybody is equal. There has to be commitment to the work that is being done. There has to be consensus, which is sometimes is very difficult, but we have to ensure that we listen to every stakeholder that is part of that project. Every stakeholder is important, and their input is equally important. So we have ethical integrity, accountability, institutionalization. So there are different ways of mapping stakeholders, but like I said, we just went through the most common methods, which is the power interest matrix. But there are other more complex strategies like these ones here, and I've also just included some. I've also included some of the additional information if you want to read more about this. And I think for now we're gonna go on a break, and then when we'll come back to do like the more practical aspect. But before we go on the break, I just want to acknowledge Professor B. Marie Schmidt from the SMRC that was very much helped me trained me into the strategies, and as well as Professor Nazreen Jasani, who's here at Stellenbosch University, and Dr. Jill Black, who's also here, that I used some of her content to go through this lecture. So I just want to acknowledge this, and obviously most importantly, Dr. Astrid, who is the lead of the public squares, and my colleagues, Amira and Nikali, for just assisting and organizing this workshop. So we're going to go on a break now, on a tea break, and then we'll come back about 15 minutes. We'll come back in 15 minutes to do the practical exercise of stakeholder mapping and analysis, and then developing a KT strategy.
No questions?
Oh, yeah, questions. Sorry. They're also telling me questions. Yeah, questions. Sorry. Yes.
Wait for the mic.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Plasto from Occupational Therapy. You were talking about stakeholder engagement mapping your stakeholders as being a very expensive exercise. And I just want to understand, where does the expense lie? Why is it expensive to do your stakeholder mapping?
So it's expensive in terms of time. It takes time, and usually you need to start mapping before the project starts. So how do you account for that in terms of your finances? You still have to account for your finances and time as well. So it's timing, and also accounting to your funders in terms of how you are actually allocating funding to this exercise in that context.
So how much time do you need to do your stakeholder mapping? If you're going to engage in the process really robustly, how much time do you think that you need for the team to work together to do the mapping exercises?
So for me, for instance, I've developed another project that I want to work on. I've already started the stakeholder engagement. So it can even start like a year before. So obviously a year before, not everybody has to be engaged at the beginning. Like for me right now, I'm building relationships. So I have to go to the community, speak to, and because I don't have funding now. So I'm taking over. That's what I'm saying. Maybe I shouldn't have said it's very expensive, but it's very difficult to account for it, even when in terms of the funders, because right now, funders, they want research that is impactful. And if you want research to be impactful, you really need to the stakeholder, transdisciplinary research, stakeholder mapping, stakeholder engagement is a key part of it, but it's very difficult to account for it. So I sort of absorb those costs, time and those costs. I've absorbed those costs. So I have to make contact with people on the ground. I have to know the community organization in the community. I have to do great literature, where I have to go into the great literature and find out who are the key stakeholders in this space. I have to start talking to them, of course. So I would say even a year prior to the work starting itself, must already start. And then obviously start building a team, identifying who are the people that you need, who have the right skills, both from your academics aspect and from the community aspect. Identify those people, start bringing them together, and then from there you start developing. Then you can now start mapping and going through the whole stakeholder mapping and analysis. But prior to even that, there's a lot of work that has to be done to build up to that. And most of it, I have to, you have to sort of absorb the cost. I have no choice but to absorb those costs. There's a couple of hands. Who was this? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mulopo, for the presentation. I totally relate to this topic because I'm also a master's student from a rehab. I'm a physio, and I'm currently doing my master's project with a lot of interdisciplinary people. So I'm working with oncologists and I'm working with ENT specialists as well. My question is, how does one deal with the blockers, the active resistors, or somebody who holds power to actually prevent you from doing your study? Because I had sort of a similar situation where I had forgotten about a stakeholder, a very important one, and when ethics got back to me, I had to then approach that stakeholder for an approval. And I was a little bit scared because the project was like far at the end, and I should have actually approached them at the beginning. And obviously, being brave, I had to put it out there and motivate my study and substantiate my study. But he had every right to actually say, no, I do not agree. So how does one navigate such instances where you actually forget a stakeholder, or you meet a resistance, or somebody who's just not coming to the table?
Well, I don't have all the answers, but obviously I'm just going to share from my experience. I can stand here and say you have to map your stakeholders, make sure I identify the stakeholders, make sure everybody's in the room. But it does happen that you may miss a stakeholder. But I also believe that if you really paid, like you say, you probably didn't put in a lot of effort in the beginning. So maybe if you, in terms of mapping and sitting down, I don't know if you sat down with people to help you map, or were you able to do that?
No, actually, but I find it to be evolving as well. As you go through the process, you learn from a person that, oh, actually, this might be somebody important to talk to. So I feel like it's also an evolving process.
100%.
Even though you map at the beginning, you find missing links as you go through your projects or your research.
So that can happen. But one thing I've learned from my experience is building relationships. Building, whoever you've identified in the beginning, try to build relationships. It shouldn't just be a once off, in and out, and get what you wanted and move on. It really has to be a relationship that you keep building, and then a relationship that will evolve into trust. And that's something that keeps coming up every time we do work on policies. There's an element of trust that needs to come for instance, policymakers to actually trust you as a researcher, for policymakers to actually use your work. So there has to be that ongoing relationship that happens. And also why I'm emphasizing that is that from one of my mentors who works closely with government as well. How she navigates that is that she warns them even in advance. She'll be like, so the issue thing, like, the most important thing is the relationship. She has a relationship with him that she's built and invested intentionally over time, to the point that now she has them on WhatsApp, so that if anything happens, even if they're about to publish a report that is saying there's so much pollution here and there, she calls them, she tells them ahead of time, hey, this is what our report is finding. This is what we found, and this is what we're about to publish. And sometimes they tell her, you know what, thank you for letting us know. Please don't publish that report now. Let's first prepare ourselves, do whatever they need to do, and then give us, for instance, they'll say, give us 2 weeks before you publish that report. And then whatever they need to sort it out, and then they'll report, and then they'll publish. So it's mostly about relationships. That's the only way I can answer your question. Like, you have to genuinely build relationships. And also, if you're working as a researcher within specific groups of people, once you build a good relationship even with one, the word starts to go out. So word starts to go out. You can now maybe make a reference to another one. They might know each other, and that can just help you. There's no one perfect answer, but one thing in summary I can say: build relationships that can lead to trust, genuine relationship that will lead to trust, and then you have that flow of information going back and forth. Yes, there's more hands.
Greetings to the panel at large. So you just mentioned that you are currently doing some projects. So my question for you is, what lights the fire within you as a transdisciplinary researcher, and also how do you overcome your daily setbacks that you face as an individual?
I want to grow as a researcher. I want to grow. I don't want to just be here. My dream is to become one of the influencing researchers on the African planet and African continent. On the African continent. At least I caught myself very early. On the African continent. And also because, earlier on in my life as a child, my parents travel a lot. So like we moved from one country to another, and I had an experience earlier on in my childhood, and then in my sort of young adult life, I realized, oh my goodness, this issue could have been prevented. So it's around infectious diseases. It's a place where we lived, and there was like an infectious disease. A lot of kids died because they did not have access to healthcare. And then when I was doing my master's, I realized, oh no, this is actually something that can be prevented by so and so, by just, having the right resources, having proper leadership. So that motivates me to be able to contribute and to solutions that are impacting people, not just people generally, but the African population. So it's whatever I'm doing, it's in my own capacity, above and beyond my day work, my day job. I have my day job, but above and beyond, I'm writing my own projects in my time after work, sacrifice a few hours after work, write your own project, because I believe I am capable and I can really do what I need to do. So you just have to push yourself. You might not always have the support, you might not always have the resources, but I also trust in God strongly that everything is possible with God. Yeah, so that's what keeps me going. And there are a lot of questions, but I'm getting a signal that time. Juliet, and I saw another. Can I have Juliet? And then the last, those two hands, please. The last two hands. Oh, can we talk? Oh, okay. And can I have him as the last person? That will be it.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm Juliet from the Division of Health Systems and Public Health. My question is, at what point in time, because like now we could be busy writing concept papers, but I can see that all those can be dismantled into something else, the way I'm looking at the process. So at what point in time do you start doing the real like engagement, like going to the place where you were planning to do the research, where you stop like doing the actual writing of your concept paper and trying to look at what is the real thing. And my other question is, it looks like transdisciplinary research is quite complex, and the budget issues, I can see that it's maybe even 10 times like the novel research that we usually do. So how do you account for these budgets when you are writing a proposal to a donor? Because when you're looking at the process of stakeholder mapping, knowledge translation, stakeholder engagement, it's not one size fits all. You may think that it is something small, but it may end up very big. You may think it is something big, but it may end up very small. So how do you determine that in your budgeting, especially when you are trying to submit for funding? Thanks.
So, briefly, yeah. So I think it falls under engagement because I've seen other budgets, other funding having engagement, community engagement as a budget line. So, and then you just have to justify it. If it's a lot of money, if you're putting whatever, I was going to say 1 million or whatever, but you just need to justify to say, I'm going to have so many meetings, I'm going to go so many times. And I think that's the only way. And then for the question about my concept, you can't start engaging when you're at concept level. You have to really go, like your project has to be mature enough. When you are like solid to say this is a project, something that I've been working on for a long time as a concept that has gone under review. I've circulated it, I've gotten feedback, and it's now it's mature. And then I know this is set now. It needs to be, this is the work that I'm going to do. Then I can start engaging. Yes.
Hi, I'm Clara. I'll keep it brief. Thank you very much. That was excellent. What tickled me is what you said about how it's important that they may have different relationships amongst each other, and how it's important to keep that in mind, and also power imbalances maybe. Do you have any advice for if you want to have a focus group, at what stage can you throw those people together to kind of prevent there being those power imbalances, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So if you're doing a focus group, then you're already past engagement. You're collecting your data. I've seen with other organizations, other people have a public engagement personnel. And that's something that maybe we at Stellenbosch we need to think about. Like there's a person whose role is public engagement. So those are the people that will inform you as a researcher to say, you can't put so and so in the same room. Because we won't have all the knowledge. So those are the people that can really assist. I'm doing a fellowship right now called PEX, Public Engagement Exchange Fellowship. And one of the core factors that we're doing now is how to ensure that Stellenbosch actually buys into public engagement. So maybe that can be an answer to that. Like we really need a public engagement person that understands everything, community, and can advise researchers on the do's and don'ts. Yeah. I think that was the last question, right?
I'm going to ask one quickly.
Oh, okay.
I'm jumping in. So, thank you, Chanelle. And sorry I was a bit late, but I caught most of it, and I thought it was very interesting and well delivered. I just wanted to take a step back to one of the points you made when I first walked in, which was around mutual benefit. And I think that some of the slides that you showed, there was an emphasis when, like a knowledge translation coming from us to them. And I think that it's just really important to emphasize how important it's a bi-directional process, and that's why it's really important to engage people right from the outset, even before research begins, in a more informal way, having stakeholder meetings so that the project itself, from the conceptualization stage, is designed with mutual benefit in mind. And that's one of the strongest way of bringing people on board, so that the objectives of the projects are aligned with the people that it's meant to serve.
Yes.
And then that can be a really powerful and impactful project.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, so I just thought I'd emphasize that.
Okay, no,
Thanks.
thank you. I think the last comments, question or comments.
Thank you so much. Also, apologies for arriving late. I'm not from here. But I'm working in psychiatry, currently conducting an MEd or a candidate MEd. Basically, there's a new evolving field of geopsychiatry. So the question is, and I'll keep this as brief as I can, although there's many more to ask, but from a transdisciplinary perspective, bridging psychology, psychiatry, political ecology, and anthropology. I'm concerned that traditional stakeholder mapping often replicates epistemic violence by centering institutional power while marginalizing the informal, quote unquote, trust architectures that actually govern access in under-resourced African settings. And in the field that I'm working in, where stressors are deeply tied to displacements and geopolitical instability all over the world, as we can see right now, buy-in isn't granted by ministries. It's negotiated by traditional leaders, religious figures, and community elders. And yes, there is buy-in from ministries as well, but you have to incorporate these people as well, who operate outside the state apparatus, if you want to call it like that. So my question is, how do we design a stakeholder framework that doesn't just list these actors, but actively visualizes the tension between biomedical authority and local epistemic systems? Specifically, how can we use this map to identify bridge stakeholders who hold legitimacy in both worlds, ensuring that they are structurally resourced and protected rather than exploited as mere translators? And if our map only reflects hierarchy, aren't we risking interventions that are actually clinically sound, beneficial, but are often socially invisible? My name is Ibrahim Sayyidabad.
Hi, Ibrahim. Thank you for that very, very deep question. I mean, it's good that you're thinking that way. It's very important to think out of what we are being taught and what we have. And also we have to put in mind that a lot of the work that we do, a lot of theories that we apply are theories that were developed in the West and not theories that were developed in our context. So when it comes to working within our context, so decolonization has to happen at every level of our work. So I think it could be something that you can also start in terms of, okay, we have this as our starting point of how we can map stakeholders. How can we ensure that this map can be much more adaptable to our context? How do we bring all these different epistemologies? How can they play that? As a researcher, you are allowed to question that and do something different, add to it, take out some things from it, as long as the process is well documented and justifiable, and you can publish and say, this is how we can do this in the African context in a much better way, in a way that is more applicable to us. I agree with you in terms of there's a lot of hierarchy to it, but I was also trained as a social scientist in psychology, and we work, our approach has always been a bottom-up approach. like how do we ensure that we move away from the top down approach to the bottom up approach? There's still that conflict that happens, but questions like this is what will help us to really push for that bottom up approach. So I don't have like a full answer, but what I can see is that's what we need to start thinking of as researchers. How can we make sure that whatever that we have can now be decolonized and applicable and built from the bottom up within our African context? But looking at lived experience, you talked about all these different types of knowledge systems. Bring in your lived experience, and that's what it's also key. I probably didn't mention it. Transdisciplinary research, those are experts as well. Those are our partners. The lived-in experience also have a role. It's not just the so-called experts, the academics, but those also have the knowledge. Traditional knowledge systems, they all are on the same level. Basically, there shouldn't be any hierarchy. And in transdisciplinary research, we talk about creating spaces for all knowledges to coexist and be embraced, and not just one form of knowledge.
Thank you. I'll come back to the decolonial question after the break.
Yeah, and we can continue talking over the tea break.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.